I was having dinner recently with an old friend, a man I've known for years to be gentle, rational, and incredibly nuanced in his thinking. We were halfway through a pleasant meal when the conversation drifted toward a specific political group he opposes. The transformation was almost biological. It wasn't just that his mood shifted, his entire physiology seemed to reconfigure. The guy who, minutes earlier, was talking about his daughter's piano recital with such warmth, suddenly leaned in, his pupils dilated, his jaw tight. He started describing these people not as opponents, but as a cancer, a plague that needed to be cleansed. He wasn't debating policy anymore. He was dehumanizing millions of strangers with a terrifying level of ease. But here's the detail that really struck me, the one that made the neuropsychiatrist in me sit up and take notice. While his words were screaming anger and moral outrage, his face was telling a completely different story. There was a subtle, undeniable glimmer of satisfaction in his eyes, a micro-expression of relief. Every time he called them filth, he looked like a man who had just taken a hit of a powerful drug. He thought he was suffering from righteous indignation, but observationally. He was being rewarded. He believed he was sharing a profound insight with me. But watching that strange disconnect between his professed misery and his visible chemical gratification, I realized I wasn't looking at a man forming an argument. I was looking at a host feeding a parasite.
That image, a host feeding a parasite, that's exactly where we need to start this deep dive.
It felt biological. That's the only way I can describe it.
Because it is. We're going to be looking at this neuropsychiatric model of hate, this idea that extremism isn't just a bad idea, it acts like a self-sustaining organism inside the brain. Our whole mission here is to unpack the science of how we stop seeing other people as people.
Okay, so let's start there. Let's call this first part hate as a neurobiological organism. The foundation of all of this, the thing that lets that parasite get its hooks in, is dehumanization. We hear that word all the time, but what is it really? What's the core mechanism?
The core mechanism is, well, it's terrifyingly simple. It's about removing moral weight. It's a psychological trick that facilitates violence by essentially disarming your conscience.
Disarming your conscience?
Yeah, when you dehumanize a group, you're denying them the moral consideration you'd normally grant to any human being. And that weakens all the important restraints, things like empathy, compassion. It's so much more than just prejudice or stigma.
Right, because if you stigmatize someone, you still see them as a person, just a person you don't like or think is inferior.
Exactly. You still see them as human. Dehumanization is a step further. It's the denial of their fundamental moral and mental worth. Psychologists have a great term for it. Dementalization.
Dementalization.
You're denying their mind, their interior life, their capacity to feel joy or to suffer or to have complex thoughts. They become an object, an animal, a disease. And once that happens, well, you don't need human restraint to deal with the disease.
I like that term, dementalization, because it's so specific. It's a refusal to acknowledge the internal landscape. They're just a thing, maybe a threatening thing, but not a thing that can suffer in a way that matters to you.
Precisely. And when their suffering no longer has relevance, the door is wide open for the most extreme forms of violence. It's what allows humanity to, in a sense, attack itself.
And history just gives us one horrifying example after another. The language is almost always the same because the goal is the same.
The pattern is tragically consistent. It always relies on creating this stark, binary opposition, us versus them.
Like with the transatlantic slave trade?
A perfect, awful example. African people were systematically portrayed as lacking rationality, lacking culture, lacking moral agency. The whole narrative was that they were biologically suited for enslavement. They were savages, which immediately justifies the civilized using violence to control them.
The second you successfully brand someone a savage, their life just loses its moral weight.
It's gone. And of course, this reached its most systematic and chilling peak during the Holocaust. The Nazis used animalistic metaphors constantly.
Vermin pests.
Vermin, bacillus, a plague. Not just political opponents, but biological threats that needed to be cleansed. The term they used, Untermensch, or subhuman, wasn't just an insult. It was a bureaucratic tool designed to legally and morally sever their connection to the human community.
That language of contagion, it's so powerful, isn't it? When you call people vermin or a bacillus, you're tapping into a primal fear. A disease has to be eradicated for public health. So you're reframing genocide as, what, a public health initiative.
That is the deep psychological function of that metaphor. It shifts the entire frame from a moral problem to a sanitation problem. This wasn't just about race. Think about the state-sponsored eugenics programs, Action T4, where individuals with disabilities were deemed leben sunvertis leben.
A life unworthy of life.
It shows that dehumanization can be aimed at anyone. It's about constructing an outgroup that lacks whatever qualities the in-group decides are essential for being fully human.
And we see these exact linguistic patterns, the same metaphors popping up in modern conflicts.
We do. After the Hamas attacks, for instance, there were senior officials in the Israeli discourse using terms like human animals. These aren't just off-the-cuff remarks. They're direct descendants of the language used to justify mass violence throughout history.
And international legal bodies recognize this, right?
They absolutely do. Those kinds of statements were cited in proceedings at the International Court of Justice. The law understands that when the rhetoric of rats and cockroaches starts, that's the on-ramp to mass violence.
It's the tell.
It's the tell. And it's not just for external enemies. The same language gets turned inward on dissenters within the in-group. Left-wing Israelis, for example, have been called dogs or microbes by hardliners. It just proves that this isn't always about a fixed racial identity. It's about political and ideological alignment.
Okay, so that's the mechanism, dementalization. Now let's get inside the skull. What is the neurobiological fingerprint of this? This is where my friend's reaction at dinner starts to connect with what's happening in the brain.
This is where it gets really fascinating. Neuroimaging shows that when someone engages in this kind of dehumanized perception, there's a systematic neural shutdown.
A shutdown.
Specifically, we see very low activation in the brain's social cognition network. The two key players are the superior temporal sulcus and, most importantly, the medial prefrontal cortex, or MPFC.
The MPFC, that's our social hub, right? Why is its disengagement so central to all this?
Because the MPFC is essentially the index of humanized perception. It's the part of the brain that does mentalizing, our ability to infer what's going on in other people's minds, their beliefs, their intentions, their feelings. It also handles self-reflection.
So less MPFC activity means less social processing.
It means the brain has decided, I don't need to treat this entity as a complex human mind. It's an efficiency move, in a way. I don't need to spend the energy thinking about their interior life, because they don't have one that matters.
The brain literally powers down the people processing hardware, but there's that strong emotional piece too, the disgust, that feels much more primal.
Oh, absolutely. When we see certain social targets, especially those perceived as low on warmth and competence, like the homeless or drug addicts in some studies, the primary emotion elicited is disgust. And in the brain, that disgust corresponds to high activity in the insula.
Okay, so the insula lights up. What happens to the MPFC?
It goes dark. Much less activity. So you have the switch. The primal disgust center turns on, and the complex social processing center turns off.
Wow.
And this has led to a really powerful insight. This whole process might be a spontaneous strategy to avoid empathy.
To avoid empathy exhaustion.
Exactly. If it takes a lot of cognitive and emotional energy to simulate another person's suffering, and your brain has classified them as disgusting and non-human, it just bypasses the whole problem. It's a way of conserving energy. If they aren't really suffering, I don't have to feel bad about it.
Which makes the whole system self-reinforcing. And that brings us right back to the reward, that glimmer of satisfaction I saw. Radicalization has to be plugging directly into the brain's reward circuits.
That's the critical link. Radicalization is an extreme form of identity formation. And like any intense identity, it hijacks the brain's reward system. Specifically, the ventral striatum, or VS.
The VS is our main dopamine hub. Novelty, pleasure, reward.
Correct. And we see that the VS is often hyperactive in people with extremist tendencies. This tells us that clinging to a radical ideology isn't just a cold, logical choice. It is powerfully driven by the desire for reward.
And that reward could be social acceptance from the in-group?
Or it could be that intense internal rush of ideological satisfaction, the feeling of being morally correct, of being enlightened, of being superior to the dehumanized masses.
It feels good to hate the right people.
It's a chemical payoff for being on the right team. Every time you get a like on that polarizing post, every time a fellow believer agrees with you, that reward circuit fires. It's a neurological reinforcement loop. It can be like an addiction, but the drug is moral superiority.
So you have the reward system driving it. What about the control system, the part that should be hitting the brakes?
That's the prefrontal cortex, the PFC, which handles our executive functions. And what the data suggests is that in people who are highly susceptible to extremism, we see reduced PFC activity.
So the brakes are weak.
The brakes are weak. Their capacity for cognitive control, for emotional regulation, is compromised. If the PFC isn't doing its job as the control center, you're far more likely to engage in the impulsive, extreme behaviors that these ideologies demand.
Okay, so let's recap the system. The social brain, the MPFC, shuts down. The primal disgust center, the insula, fires up. And the reward center, the VS, reinforces the whole cycle. To lock this all in place, the brain then uses powerful cognitive biases.
Right, and the first and maybe the most dangerous one in this context is motivated reasoning. This isn't about finding the truth. It's about confirming what you emotionally need to be true.
Which is that my side is good and your side is evil.
Exactly. And that emotional need leads directly to dichotomous thinking. Black and white.
Yeah.
Us versus them. All the nuance, all the complexity, which is cognitively expensive, just gets thrown out the window for a simple binary that is very, very satisfying to the brain.
And we can see this in brain scans.
We can. We see the precuneus is highly active when people are processing narratives that align with their ideology. The precuneus is involved in self-awareness, connecting things to our sense of self.
So its activation means the brain is saying, this story isn't just true, this story is me.
It's fundamentally your story.
Yeah.
It feels essential and non-negotiable. Then you layer on top of that the self-enhancement bias. This is where that satisfaction my friend Phil comes from.
Explain that.
The MPFC, even when it's partly offline for others, is always running a self-evaluation mode that's biased towards ourselves. In extremism, that bias goes into overdrive. You inflate all the positive traits of your in-group. We're virtuous, we're pure, we're the victims.
And you do the opposite for the out-group.
Precisely. You dismiss any of their positive traits, and you amplify their malice and their threat. So when your friend calls them a plague, his brain is immediately giving him a hit of reward by reinforcing the thought. And therefore, I, the one fighting the plague, am righteous and good. It's a perfect self-serving loop.
That is a terrifyingly effective system. It isolates you, it rewards you for outrage, and it shuts down the very parts of the brain you'd need to feel empathy. So, how do we break it? How do we force the brain to see the humanity it has erased? That takes us to part 2. Counteracting the erasure of interiority.
And we have to start with a bit of hope here, because what we see is that these neural signatures of dehumanization are highly malleable. They are not hardwired.
Malleable. Okay, where do we see that? How can we bend them back?
We see it in the amygdala.
Mm-hmm.
The amygdala is our threat detection center, and it often flares up when we see outgroup faces. But, and this is crucial, that activity drops off significantly when those faces become familiar or when they become individuated.
So you stop seeing them as a generic them and start seeing them as an individual.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's the neural basis for why things like intergroup contact can work. Yeah. But there's an even more direct way to do this, demonstrated by something called the individuation task.
Okay, what's that?
So researchers showed participants images of these previously dehumanized groups. Then they asked them to do one of two things. One was a superficial judgment, like guess their age. The other was a mentalizing task. Guess which vegetable they prefer.
Wait, are you telling me the difference between dehumanization and empathy could come down to guessing if someone likes broccoli? That feels too simple.
It sounds simple, but the mechanism is profound. It's not about the vegetable. It's about forcing your brain to infer a mind, a preference, a subjective inner world. And when participants did that, the neural bias was dramatically reduced. And here's the kicker. The MPFC, the part of the brain that had shut down, it could be reactivated.
Wow. So by forcing the brain to do this simple task of acknowledging an inner life, even a trivial one, you're basically flipping the social processing hardware back on.
You're reversing the omission. You're forcing the brain to stop treating them like an object and start treating them like a person again. And that leads directly to the importance of promoting empathy.
We talk about empathy a lot, but what is it scientifically?
At a neural level, empathy is about using your own brain to simulate another person's internal state. You're essentially recreating their emotional patterns inside yourself. It involves specific brain systems, like the anterior cingulate cortex and the anterior insula. It's the ultimate countermeasure because it directly rebuilds that moral constraint.
Which, as you said, is cognitively demanding, so real-world strategies have to make it easier.
That's why positive, sustained intergroup contact is so important. It can directly lower that amygdala threat response, making it easier for the MPFC to come back online and for empathy to happen. The goal has to be promoting critical thinking and facilitating that kind of genuine individuating contact.
Okay, let's zoom out from the individual brain to the social world. Radicalization is a twisted form of identity building. So let's talk about identity formation and narrative coherence in the digital age. How do we normally build a healthy sense of self, and how is that process getting hijacked?
A healthy identity is basically a coherent story you tell about yourself. An adolescent starts with just disjointed descriptions, but eventually they build an autobiographical narrative, a life story that connects their past, their present, and their imagined future.
And when that story is weak or incoherent,
extremist narratives are right there, offering a simple, powerful, ready-made story to fill the void.
So how is that healthy story normally built?
It's built through dialogue, specifically with what we call narrative partners, parents, friends, mentors. They provide the social scaffolding you need to construct a meaningful story about yourself. They do three crucial things.
Okay, let's break those down. First one is elaboration.
Elaboration is about finding the meaning in your experiences. Your narrative partner pushes you beyond just stating facts. They ask questions about effect. How did that make you feel? About content. What did that teach you? About meaning, how does this fit into the person you want to become? Without that, your life is just a series of disconnected data points.
And the second function, grappling, feels really key to fighting extremism.
It's the hardest one. Grappling is when your partner supports you as you explore challenging ideas, even ideas that contradict your core beliefs. It requires patience, open-mindedness, acceptance. If your partner freaks out and condemns you, the grappling stops. You just retreat back into certainty.
That feels almost impossible in a lot of digital spaces. If an algorithm is rewarding outrage and quick dunks, how can anyone grapple?
It's fundamentally hostile to it. Grappling needs time, nuance, and emotional safety. When a platform design limits you to, say, 280 characters, you're predisposed to insult, not to ask a clarifying question. You can't show patience and acceptance, so exploration gets punished and certainty gets rewarded.
And the third function?
Attention and validation. This is when your partner has affirmed your emerging story and its values. It consolidates your identity. The danger with extremism is that it offers this validation instantly before you've even done the hard work of grappling.
All of this depends on introspection, right? The ability to look inward. How is the digital world affecting that, this dual impact?
It's a huge tension. On one hand, you have the massive distraction risk. The endless scroll, the information overload, it just depletes the cognitive resources you need for quiet contemplation and self-reflection. When you're constantly bombarded with external noise, it's hard to hear your own internal voice.
Making you much more vulnerable to a loud, simple external narrative from an extremist group.
Exactly. But on the other hand, there's also an elaboration opportunity. Social media platforms are built for telling stories about ourselves. The key is the design. A long-form blog post allows for much deeper elaboration and grappling than a short, ephemeral video clip.
This digital world also changes how we relate to our culture. It's not as simple as the internet making everyone a Westerner.
Not at all. It's much more nuanced. We see examples of digital media being a motor of change. In Ethiopia, for instance, just giving adolescents laptops, even without internet, led to a significant shift toward endorsing gender equality.
Just the tool itself, not the content.
It seems so. It suggests that having access to that technology fosters a sense of agency and self-efficacy, which can empower you to critically reevaluate traditional roles. We saw a similar thing with Bedouin youth and internet use.
But at the same time, it can reinforce cultural continuity.
Right. In Thailand, for example, adolescents use their digital skills to help their parents, acting as tech support. In doing so, they were actually upholding traditional values of filial piety and respecting their elders, just in a new, modern context.
They found a way to be modern and traditional at the same time.
Exactly. And we see really sophisticated strategies for managing this. Studies of Muslim university students show them actively segmenting their audiences online. They'll use privacy settings to present a virtuous self to their conservative family members while exploring and expressing different ideas with their peer group.
So they're curating two different identities, two different narratives.
They're actively negotiating their identity in a complex social world using the tools the platform gives them. It's incredibly sophisticated.
That's a perfect lead-in to our final and maybe most urgent section, Part 3, Vulnerability and the Engineered Emergency. We've seen how hate works and how identity can be rebuilt, but why are some of us so much more vulnerable to begin with? It seems to come down to basic biological burnout.
It absolutely does. The high-stress, polarized digital world is engineered to exploit our pre-existing physiological deficits. And this all centers on our executive functions, or EFs. They are the cognitive buffer that keeps us rational. When your EFs are low, you are a prime target for simple, binary narratives.
Okay, define EFs for us. What are they?
They're the CEO of your brain. The high-level control processes, the three core ones are inhibition, your ability to stop an impulse, like not firing back an angry comment.
Right.
Working memory, your ability to hold and manipulate information, like following a complex argument. And flexibility, which is your ability to shift your perspective.
And these are the first things to go when we're running on empty. Let's look at the data. What does sleep loss do to this cognitive buffer?
The evidence is stark. Just 4 hours of sleep for 2 nights in a row significantly impairs your executive functioning. In one key study, participants in that condition were measurably worse on a standard cognitive control test.
How much worse? Give us the numbers.
They produced 1.07 fewer correct designs. Now, that might sound small, but in cognitive science, that's a real measurable deficit. It means your brain, just from being tired, has lost the bandwidth to generate a creative, nuanced solution to a problem. It will default to the easiest path.
And sleep loss almost never happens in a vacuum. It's usually piled on top of stress.
That's right. And chronic stress has a similar effect. One study found that for every 1-point increase on the perceived stress scale, a person's performance dropped by 0.21 correct designs.
Make that tangible for us. What does that mean for an actual person?
Okay, so someone who is 1 standard deviation above the average stress level would make about 2.4 fewer correct designs than someone 1 standard deviation below. Let's put it together. If you're doom scrolling at 2 in the morning after a terrible week at work, your PFC is down, 3.5 points? You're biologically less capable of nuanced thought than you would be if you were rested and calm.
So our physiological state, how much we slept, how stressed we are, directly impacts our ability to resist hate. This is how the colonization of the mind happens.
Right. Chronic stress creates what's called allostatic load. Your body's stress response system fails to shut down, and it wears you out, reduces your buffer capacity. And sleep loss just piles on top of that.
So researchers thought this would be a 2-hit model, right? That stress and sleep loss together would cause a total collapse.
That was the hypothesis, that the two would interact and make things exponentially worse.
But that's not what they found.
It's not. And this was a really crucial finding. They found no statistical interaction. They simply act as 2 separate significant hits that decrease your performance. The effects are additive, not multiplicative.
That's so interesting because it feels multiplicative. A sleepless night when you're already stressed feels like it breaks you. Why doesn't the data show that catastrophic collapse?
It might suggest that our executive function systems are pretty robust, but they have a finite capacity. While it's not a catastrophic interaction, the end result is still compromised cognition. Being down 2.4 points from stress and another 1.07 from sleep loss, you're still operating at a massive deficit.
And compromised cognition leads to vulnerability in decision-making.
That's the danger. A dysregulated PFC, our impulse control center, makes us more prone to impulsive extreme behavior. Your ability to properly value different outcomes is altered. You're just far more susceptible to emotionally charged, polarizing narratives because you lack the sophisticated cognitive machinery to fight back.
It makes total sense. You don't have the energy to fight propaganda when you're exhausted. So if the problem is neurobiological, the solution has to be about building neurobiological resilience.
And one of the most established ways to do that is cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT. It's a clinically validated way to help people de-radicalize by directly targeting their cognitive distortions.
How does that work on a brain level? Is it like taking your PFC to the gym?
That is a perfect analogy.
Yeah.
CBT forces you to identify and restructure irrational beliefs, that black and white thinking. By making you consider nuance, you are literally exercising and strengthening the prefrontal cortex. You're building back that cognitive flexibility. At the same time, it helps you regulate emotions like anger, which means getting a handle on the amygdala.
But this can't all be an individual's problem. We have to look at the environment, right?
Absolutely. This has to be a biopsychosocial model. We know, for example, that social exclusion lights up the same neural pathways as physical pain. If you feel excluded and alone, you are incredibly vulnerable to any group that promises belonging. Economic deprivation is another huge factor.
And finally, what do we do when we're up against these deeply held, almost religious beliefs, these sacred values that aren't open to rational debate?
That is a huge challenge. When a belief is sacred, trying to offer a rational argument or a material trade-off can actually trigger a backfire effect. It makes them cling to the belief even harder. They feel like you're asking them to sell their soul.
So you can't argue them out of it. What's the alternative?
The research suggests that instead of tangible trade-offs, you have to use symbolic gestures. Gestures that acknowledge the importance of their sacred value without necessarily agreeing with it. You're signaling respect for their identity and their core beliefs. That can create just enough psychological space to open a dialogue where one was impossible before.
This has been a comprehensive and frankly a pretty sobering synthesis. We started with this personal story, this observation of a chemical reward for moral outrage. And we've gone right into the brain's architecture. We've seen how it can literally switch off its human processing network.
And we've seen how a radical identity gets built and chemically reinforced, and how basic things, simple things like sleep and stress, can wear down our defenses and make us vulnerable.
Understanding that hate isn't just a political opinion, but an actual measurable process in the brain, linked to reward, perception, and stress, that has to be the first step.
It's the only way to develop targeted strategies for resilience. The focus has to be on rebuilding that cognitive buffer, making space for real introspection, and forcing those neural pathways that recognize the humanity in others to fire again.
A true deep dive into the architecture of hatred. We've certainly given you a lot to think about.